Good evening and welcome to History for Your Sleep. You are in a calm place now. There is nothing you need to prepare for and nothing you need to remember. You may take a slow, comfortable breath and let your thoughts begin to settle. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, you may subscribe whenever it feels right. There is no rush at all. Now, let us gently begin. Imagine Japan during the Edo period, not through famous events or important names, but through the land itself, through air, weather, and the slow rhythm of seasons that shaped everyday life for ordinary people. Japan is a mountainous country. Much of its land rises sharply, leaving limited flat areas for farming and settlement. Villages, towns, and cities were shaped carefully around what the terrain allowed. Fields followed valleys and river plains. Homes gathered wherever the ground permitted stable building. This geography alone made daily life attentive and practical. Nothing could be wasted. Space, materials, and time were all treated with care. But land was only part of the background. Climate mattered just as much. Japan's weather is strongly seasonal. Each part of the year brings its own conditions, and ordinary life adjusted constantly to them. Summer was often hot and humid, shaped by monsoon rains that filled rivers and soaked the ground. Air could feel heavy, clinging to skin and clothing. Movement slowed naturally during the hottest hours. Homes were built to breathe. Paper screens, open spaces, and light materials allowed air to move through rooms. Daily habits shifted with the heat, encouraging shade, rest, and careful pacing. Winter brought a different experience. Cold air arrived from the Asian continent, and its effects were felt unevenly across the country. On the side facing the Sea of Japan, winters were often snowy and wet. Snow gathered on rooftops, and moisture settled into wood and earth. Daily routines there included constant attention to dampness, cold, and storage. On the Pacific side, winters were usually drier but windy. Cold air moved quickly through streets and fields. Clothing layered more tightly. People stayed closer to hearths and workspaces. These regional differences mattered deeply. There was no single Japanese winter or Japanese summer. Everyday life changed depending on where a person lived. Because of this strong seasonality, habits were never fixed in one form. Food, clothing, work schedules, and even posture adapted throughout the year. An ordinary day was always slightly different depending on the season. Summer encouraged lighter clothing, early mornings, and rest during midday heat. Winter emphasized warmth, preservation, and preparation. Rainy seasons changed how people moved through streets and fields. Snow changed sound itself, softening villages and slowing footsteps. Time was felt through weather more than through numbers. People did not think in weeks or months as abstract units. They felt time through temperature, moisture, wind, and light. This environmental awareness shaped a calm attentiveness. Ordinary people lived closely with the natural world, not in opposition to it. Daily life adjusted rather than resisted. Even cities followed this rhythm. Although urban areas like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto were dense and busy, they were still deeply exposed to climate. Buildings made of wood and paper responded quickly to humidity and cold. Streets changed character with rain, becoming darker and softer underfoot. Wind carried sounds differently in each season. Weather affected mood as well. Hot, humid air encouraged slower movement and quieter speech. Cold air encouraged closeness, shared warmth, and early evenings. Nothing about this was dramatic. It was simply constant. For ordinary people, climate was not something discussed or analyzed. It was something lived with every day. Meals were chosen because they suited the season. Clothing was selected for breathability or warmth. Work followed daylight and weather rather than strict schedules. This created a background of quiet repetition. Life felt stable not because nothing changed, but because change itself followed a known pattern. Spring arrived gradually, bringing softness and renewal. Summer pressed inward with heat and rain. Autumn cooled the air and sharpened movement. Winter slowed everything again. And within this cycle, ordinary people lived their lives. They did not rush seasons, they adapted to them. This steady relationship with land and climate formed the foundation of everyday existence in Edo period Japan. Before social structure, before work routines, before food or clothing, there was this background, quiet, persistent, and always present. From this calm environmental rhythm, everything else followed. Cities, homes, work, and rest all grew naturally from it. And as we move forward from land into human spaces, we will begin to see how ordinary people shaped their lives within this seasonal world, slowly, carefully, and without hurry. From this steady rhythm of land and seasons, everyday life moved naturally into human spaces, into towns and cities where ordinary people lived close to one another, shaped not only by weather, but by walls, streets, and shared routines. During the Edo period, cities grew large and dense. Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto became home to hundreds of thousands of people. Most of them were not elites. They were artisans, merchants, shop workers, porters, and laborers, the people often described collectively as chonin, the urban commoners. Life in these cities felt different from the countryside, but it was still governed by calm repetition rather than constant excitement. The pace was steady, familiar, and shaped by closeness. Buildings stood near one another. Streets were narrow. Space was limited, and everyone learned to live within it. One of the most common forms of housing for ordinary urban residents was the nagaya. These were long, shared residential buildings divided into small rental units. Each unit was modest in size, often consisting of just one main room. Families lived, slept, and ate within this single space. Privacy was limited, but this was expected. Walls were thin. Sounds traveled easily. You could hear footsteps from the next unit, the sound of water being drawn, quiet conversations through paper partitions. This was not considered intrusive. It was simply part of city life. Facilities were often shared. A single well might serve many households. Toilets were commonly communal, located outside the living spaces. Daily life extended naturally into courtyards and alleys. Because of this, the boundary between home and street was soft. Much of life happened in shared spaces. People washed clothes, prepared food, repaired tools, and exchanged news in view of others. The street itself became an extension of the home. In the early morning, urban neighborhoods woke gradually. Before shops officially opened, water was drawn, floors were swept, and shutters were checked. The soundscape was gentle, wood against wood, footsteps on packed earth, low voices greeting neighbors.
Homes were sparsely furnished, furniture was minimal, and space was used flexibly. During the day, a room might serve as workspace or eating area. At night, bedding would be laid out and then folded away again in the morning. This constant transformation of space was normal. Nothing remained fixed for long. Urban houses were built mostly of wood, bamboo, clay, and paper. These materials were practical and suited the climate, but they carried risk. Fire was an ever-present concern. Cooking fires, oil lamps, candles, and hearths were part of daily life. In tightly packed neighborhoods, a single spark could spread quickly. Cities like Edo experienced frequent fires, sometimes devastating entire districts. Because of this, urban residents lived with constant, quiet awareness. They were careful with flame and heat. After large fires, authorities sometimes widened streets or created open breaks between blocks, changing the city's layout slightly to reduce risk. Fire was not a rare disaster, it was a background possibility. Despite this vulnerability, life continued calmly. People rebuilt. They returned to routine. Shops opened along streets, often connected directly to living spaces. In many cases, the front of a house served as a workplace, while the back remained private. This was especially common in machiya, townhouses where commerce and domestic life existed side by side. Customers arrived on foot. Purchases were small and frequent rather than large and infrequent. Urban life encouraged daily movement and regular exchange. Food, water, and goods were often obtained along the way, integrated into the rhythm of walking through the city. Because space was tight, urban residents learned to live lightly. Objects were stored compactly, clothing was folded carefully, and nothing unnecessary was kept. Clothes were often washed and dried close to living areas. In wet weather, managing dampness became part of daily attention. Mats and thresholds helped keep dirt and moisture from spreading indoors. Weather continued to shape city life as much as rural life. Rain softened streets and darkened wood. Humidity clung to walls and clothing. Wind carried sounds and smells through alleys. In summer, shade and airflow were valued. In winter, people gathered closer indoors, sharing warmth where possible. Despite density, cities were not chaotic. They were organized through habit and mutual understanding. Neighbors relied on one another, sometimes without speaking. Living close meant knowing routines, knowing when others rose, worked, bathed, and rested. This closeness created a quiet social awareness. people adjusted their movements and voices instinctively. Urban life was not anonymous in the modern sense. It was intimate, repetitive, and deeply patterned. And within this environment, ordinary people built lives that felt stable and predictable, not because conditions were easy, but because they were understood. From these narrow streets and shared walls, the details of daily living emerged: how people used their homes, how they cooked, rested, and prepared for work. And as we move closer inside these small living spaces, we begin to see how ordinary urban life was shaped by simplicity, routine, and careful use of every corner. From the narrow streets and shared walls of the city, everyday life moved inward. Behind sliding doors and paper screens, ordinary people shaped their private world within very limited space. What they lacked in size, they replaced with routine, order, and careful use of every corner. For many urban residents, home meant a single room inside a nagaya. This room served many purposes. It was a place to sleep, eat, work, and rest. Nothing in it was fixed forever. During the day, the space felt open. Bedding was folded and stored away. The floor was swept. Light entered through paper screens, soft and diffused. At night, the same room transformed. Futons were laid out carefully. Personal items were brought closer. The room became intimate and quiet. This daily transformation was not inconvenient. It was expected. It created rhythm. Furniture was minimal: a low table, storage boxes, a few household tools. Tatami mats covered the floor, defining how people sat, moved, and rested. They created warmth and softness, but also required care. Keeping them clean and dry was part of daily attention, especially during humid seasons. In Machiya, the urban townhouse used by merchants and artisans, the arrangement differed slightly. The front of the building often opened directly to the street and functioned as a shop or workshop. Behind it, deeper inside the structure, lay the living space. These houses were typically narrow at the front and long in depth. This shape was practical for crowded streets and taxation based on frontage. Light entered from inner courtyards or small openings, creating gentle contrasts between bright and shaded areas. Work and home were not clearly separated. Daily life moved naturally between them. A craftsman could pause his work to eat, then return without leaving the building. In rural areas, ordinary people lived in minka. These homes were larger than urban dwellings, but still simple. Built from wood, clay, and straw, they were designed to respond directly to the environment. At the heart of many minka was the irori, a sunken hearth set into the floor. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook. Family members gathered around it during cold months. Smoke from the irori rose slowly into the roof space before escaping. Over time, this smoke darkened beams and dried the structure, helping preserve it. The smell of smoke became part of the home's identity. Rural houses were closely tied to seasonal work. Tools were stored nearby. Food preparation and repair work often happened indoors during colder or wetter periods. Despite differences between urban and rural homes, some patterns remained constant. Living space was used efficiently. Objects were few but meaningful. Everything had a place. Water was precious and managed carefully. In cities, water was drawn from shared wells. In villages, it came from nearby sources. Washing, cooking, and cleaning followed habitual sequences learned early in life. Toilets were typically separate from the main living space. In urban Nagaya, they were communal. This encouraged people to move outdoors regularly and reinforced the shared nature of daily life. Because homes were small, much activity happened outside. Courtyards, alleys, and streets became extensions of domestic space. Neighbors saw one another daily. They shared sounds, smells, and routines. Inside the home, sound was soft. Paper screens absorbed noise. Voices remained low. Movements were careful. This was not enforced by rules. It was simply how one lived close to others. Cleanliness was valued, but not in a modern sense. It was practical. Floors were kept clear. Items were wiped and stored. Order made small spaces livable. Meals were prepared simply. Cooking equipment was basic. Heat sources were managed cautiously due to fire risk. Oil lamps and candles provided light after sunset. Their glow was limited, encouraging earlier rest. Night brought quiet naturally. Home was not a place for display. It was a place for function and repetition. Beauty appeared in small details: the texture of tatami, the grain of wood, the way light fell across paper screens. These environments shaped behavior. People sat close to the ground. They moved slowly indoors. They learned to read space and adjust their actions accordingly. In such homes, daily rituals mattered: folding bedding, preparing rice, opening and closing screens, sweeping floors. These actions marked time more clearly than clocks. Life inside the home was not separate from the outside world. Weather entered through sound and air. Seasonal change was felt immediately. And within these modest interiors, ordinary people found continuity. They returned each evening to spaces that changed with them but remained familiar. From these homes, daily life flowed outward again into work, markets, and shared facilities. And among those shared spaces, one place held particular importance for cleanliness, rest, and quiet social contact. From the quiet interior of the home, daily life moved outward once more. Morning did not arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, through familiar actions repeated every day. Before work began, there was water. In urban neighborhoods, people stepped outside early, carrying buckets or wooden containers. The shared well stood at the center of routine. Rope slid through hands. Wood creaked softly. Water rose from the ground, cool and clear. This water served many purposes. It was used for cooking, washing, and cleaning. Nothing was wasted. Each movement was practiced and economical. Neighbors gathered briefly, exchanging quiet greetings. No long conversations were needed. Everyone understood the sequence of the morning. Back inside the home, the day's first meal took shape. Rice was the foundation. It had often been prepared the night before, washed and left ready. In the morning, it was cooked slowly, steam filling the small space with warmth. The sound was gentle, a steady presence rather than a distraction. Alongside rice came miso soup, simple and reliable. It warmed the body, especially in colder months. Its flavor varied slightly by household and region.
shaped by local ingredients and family habits. Sometimes there was a small addition, pickled vegetables, a bit of seasonal produce. Nothing elaborate. This was not a meal meant to impress, it was meant to begin the day. People sat on the floor, close to the ground. Bowls were held carefully. Eating was quiet and focused. Morning food provided stability. It marked the transition from rest to work. Once finished, dishes were washed immediately. Water was reused when possible. Surfaces were wiped clean. The home returned quickly to order.
Clothing was adjusted for the day ahead. In warmer seasons, lighter fabrics were chosen. In colder months, layers were added. Cotton and hemp were practical, breathable, and familiar. Nothing about clothing was excessive. Movement mattered more than appearance. Before leaving, bedding was folded and stored. The room opened again, ready for its next function. For artisans and merchants, work often began at home. Tools were prepared. Shutters were checked. Front spaces were opened to the street. For others, work lay elsewhere. Shops, workshops, warehouses, or markets awaited. As people stepped into the street, the city's rhythm strengthened. Wooden shutters slid open one by one. Sweeping sounds echoed softly. Footsteps multiplied. Urban mornings were active but not hurried. Movement followed habit rather than urgency. Small purchases happened early. Food for the day, materials for work. Everything was obtained close by. This pattern reflected city life itself. People did not store large amounts. They relied on daily access. Street vendors appeared with simple offerings. Voices remained calm. Transactions were brief. Time was guided by light and routine. There were no precise schedules. Work began when it was light enough and ended as evening approached. For many, the morning was the most energetic part of the day. Heat would slow movement later. Work was paced accordingly. Seasonal differences shaped these routines. In summer, mornings began earlier to avoid midday heat. In winter, darkness lingered longer and work started later. Rain changed everything. Movement slowed. Paths softened. Attention increased. People adapted instinctively. Morning routines were not written rules. They were learned through repetition. Children observed adults. They learned when to fetch water, when to eat, when to prepare. Education for some began later in the day, but the morning still followed the same structure. This predictability created comfort. Even in crowded cities, mornings felt personal and grounded. Work did not interrupt life, it was part of the same flow. As the morning progressed, the city fully awakened. Shops received customers, workshops filled with repetitive sounds, markets grew busier. But the foundation had already been set. Water drawn, food eaten, space prepared. From this steady beginning, the rest of the day unfolded. And as ordinary people settled into their tasks, crafting, trading,
Carrying, repairing, the quiet repetition of work took over, shaping hours without needing to be measured.
As ordinary people settled into their tasks, the day found its steady rhythm. There was no sharp transition between life and work. Work was simply the continuation of the morning. In the city, artisans opened their workshops fully to the street. Light entered through wide openings. Tools were arranged carefully, each in its familiar place. Hands began moving almost on their own. A craftsman sat at a low bench, repeating motions learned long ago. Cutting, shaping, smoothing. These movements were not rushed. Speed came from familiarity, not pressure. The body knew the sequence. Sounds filled the street quietly, wood against wood, metal tapping softly, cloth moving through hands. Each workshop contributed its own layer to the city's soundscape. None of it was loud. Together, it formed a calm background. Merchants stood near their goods, ready to greet customers. Transactions were brief and practical. Prices were known. Trust mattered. Many people worked where they lived. Workspaces and homes were connected. A person could pause to eat or rest without leaving the building. This closeness shaped the pace of work. There was flexibility, but also responsibility. Tasks were done carefully because they reflected directly on the household. In markets, movement increased. Goods arrived from nearby areas. Fish, vegetables, and daily necessities passed from hand to hand. Buying and selling followed routine patterns. Most purchases were small, enough for the day. In rural areas, work followed the land. Farmers moved through fields with steady attention. Rice cultivation required constant care. Water levels were checked. Plants were inspected. Work changed with the seasons. Planting, tending, harvesting. Each stage came at its expected time. This work was repetitive but not dull. It demanded awareness. Weather, insects, and soil conditions all mattered. Tools were simple, but skill mattered deeply. Experience guided decisions more than instruction. In both city and countryside, work was physical but measured. People understood their limits. Breaks were taken when needed. Meals were simple and often eaten where one stood or sat. There was no formal separation between work and nourishment. Heat affected movement. In summer, work slowed during the hottest hours. Shade was valued. In winter, work clustered around warmth. Rain changed plans. Tasks shifted indoors when possible. Repair and preparation filled those hours. Work was rarely solitary. Even when alone, people were aware of others nearby. Shared rhythm created quiet companionship. Children observed and assisted. They learned by watching. Skills passed naturally between generations. Education, when present, complemented work rather than replacing it. Reading, writing, and counting supported trade and record keeping. But most learning happened through doing. Time passed without being counted. There were no fixed breaks. Work ended when light faded or tasks were complete. This absence of strict scheduling reduced tension. The day unfolded rather than being managed. Despite the simplicity, work held meaning.
It connected people to their community. Products were used locally. Reputation mattered. Mistakes were noticed. Care was valued. In cities, the density of life meant constant interaction. In villages, distance softened sound but not awareness. Both environments shared the same underlying pattern: steady effort, repetition, attention. As afternoon moved toward evening, the energy of work shifted. Hands slowed, tools were cleaned and stored. Shops prepared to close, fields emptied gradually. The body signaled the end of labor before the mind did. And as work released its hold on the day, another shared routine approached, one that brought warmth, cleansing, and a different kind of quiet gathering.
As tools were set aside and hands released their grip on work, attention turned naturally toward food, not as an event and not as indulgence, but as a steady anchor at the end of the day. For ordinary people in the Edo period, eating followed a pattern as reliable as the seasons themselves. Meals were simple, repetitive, comforting. At the center of almost every meal stood rice. Rice was more than nourishment. It was structure. It marked the day. Morning rice began work. Evening rice closed it. In cities, rice was often purchased daily or in small amounts. In villages, it was grown, stored, and carefully managed. In both cases, it carried weight far beyond taste. Preparing rice required attention, washing, measuring water, cooking slowly. Steam rose gently, filling small living spaces with warmth and familiarity. The smell was quiet, not strong, but deeply recognizable. Alongside rice came miso soup, simple in appearance but varied in detail. Miso differed by region and household. Some was darker, some lighter, some saltier, some mild. Many families prepared their own miso, creating flavors that became part of identity. A bowl of soup carried memory. The soup warmed the body in winter. It balanced the meal in summer. It required no explanation. Vegetables followed the seasons. What was available determined what was eaten. There was no expectation of variety beyond what the land provided at that time. In one season, leafy greens. In another, roots. Sometimes fish, depending on location and access. Meat was rare, not forbidden in every sense, but uncommon in daily life. Meals remained mostly plant-based. To accompany rice and soup, pickles, chikemono, appeared consistently. They added texture, a sharp contrast, a small brightness to an otherwise gentle meal. Pickles were practical. They preserved vegetables. They lasted through seasons. They required little fuel. Their presence was steady, not celebratory. Meals were eaten quietly, seated on the floor, bowls held close. Conversation, if present, was soft. Eating was not rushed, but not prolonged either. Food was respected, but not admired. After eating, bowls were rinsed, leftovers were minimal. Waste was avoided instinctively. The repetition of meals created comfort. People did not seek novelty every day. Familiarity mattered more. This repetition supported stability. Knowing what one would eat reduced uncertainty. Seasonality shaped everything. Summer meals felt lighter. Winter meals emphasized warmth. In hot months,
food might be eaten earlier or later in the day to avoid heat. In cold months, warm soup lingered longer. Rainy seasons affected ingredients and preparation. Humidity influenced storage. Attention increased. Urban kitchens were small, often part of the same room used for living and sleeping. Cooking equipment was basic. Fire was managed carefully. Open flames required constant awareness. In rural homes, cooking often took place around the orori. The hearth provided heat and light, as well as a place to prepare food. Smoke rose slowly, adding its scent to the house. Meals connected people to time. The day felt complete once food was eaten. Food also connected neighbors. Smells traveled through thin walls. Cooking times aligned. In dense urban housing, eating patterns synchronized naturally. When one household cooked, others were doing the same. This created a quiet, shared rhythm. Food did not separate social classes among ordinary people. Most ate similar meals. Differences were small and subtle. Occasionally, festivals or special days added variety, but these were exceptions. On ordinary days, simplicity ruled. Eating was not a performance, it was a pause. After the final meal, energy faded. Bodies slowed, thoughts quieted. Evening approached gently. And as dishes were cleared and light softened, another familiar routine awaited, one that cleansed not only the body, but also the mind, before night settled fully over the city and village alike. As evening approached and the day's work released its hold, another steady routine continued quietly in the background. Learning did not announce itself loudly. It unfolded gently alongside ordinary life. For many urban families in the Edo period, education took place in terakoya. These were small private schools that became increasingly common, especially in cities and towns during the middle and later years of the period. They were not grand buildings. Often they were simple rooms attached to homes, temples, or community spaces. Their presence blended naturally into the neighborhood. Children arrived with writing tools and paper. They removed their sandals. They entered quietly. Inside, the atmosphere was calm. Voices were low. Movements were careful. Learning here was practical. Reading, writing, counting. These skills were not abstract achievements. They were tools for daily life. For merchants, the ability to read notices and keep accounts mattered. For artisans, reading instructions and recording transactions mattered. For families, signing documents and understanding permissions mattered. Terakoya supported this practical world. Lessons followed repetition rather than explanation. Students copied characters carefully, again and again. Brushes moved slowly across paper. Mistakes were corrected gently. Progress came through patience. The teacher was often someone from the community, not a distant authority, someone familiar. This familiarity shaped the tone of learning. Discipline existed, but it was quiet. Expectation was clear. Children learned not only letters and numbers, but posture, attention, and timing. They learned how to sit still, how to listen, how to repeat. Education fit into the rhythm of the day. It did not replace work or family duties. It complemented them. Some children attended lessons in the morning. Others came later, depending on household needs. Attendance reflected practical realities rather than strict schedules. Learning did not feel separate from life, it was woven into it. In cities, literacy among ordinary people gradually became common. This supported a growing culture of written communication. Signs, notices, records. Paper and ink became part of the everyday environment. Documents passed through hands quietly. This documental aspect of life did not feel bureaucratic to those living it. It felt normal. Education also encouraged a sense of order. Understanding instructions and permissions helped people navigate controlled movement and urban regulations. Terracotta did not aim to elevate children into elite positions. It prepared them to function smoothly within their world. Lessons ended quietly, brushes were cleaned, paper was gathered. Children stepped back into the street, returning to family life. Learning did not demand attention, it waited patiently. In rural areas, formal schooling was less common, but basic literacy still appeared through community instruction and practical need. Education followed opportunity rather than obligation. For many families, even limited literacy made a difference. It changed how they interacted with markets, authorities, and neighbors. But learning remained modest in scope. There were no examinations, no public recognition. The goal was competence, not distinction. This quiet approach matched the broader rhythm of Edo period life. Learning supported stability rather than change. It reinforced repetition. It strengthened routine. As evening deepened, attention shifted again. Children returned home. Families gathered. The day moved toward rest. And with night approaching, another shared space prepared to receive ordinary people, a place of warmth, steam, and familiar voices, where the body could release the day's effort before sleep arrived. As families returned home and evening settled into the city, everyday life continued to flow through spaces that were neither fully private nor fully public. In Edo period cities, much of ordinary life existed between walls in shared places that quietly supported the rhythm of the day. Urban living relied heavily on common infrastructure. Water, sanitation, and movement were rarely contained within individual homes. They belonged to the neighborhood. At the center of many urban blocks stood a shared well. This was not merely a utility, it was a daily meeting point. From early morning until evening, people came and went, drawing water for cooking, washing, and cleaning. Buckets were lowered carefully, ropes moved through familiar hands, water rose slowly. The sound of the well became part of the neighborhood's background. It marked time without marking importance. Because water was shared, people learned to be mindful. Waiting was normal. Order emerged without instruction. Toilets, too, were often communal. Located outside the main living spaces, they served multiple households. This arrangement encouraged regular movement outdoors and reinforced the shared nature of daily routines. These facilities were maintained through habit and mutual responsibility. They were not hidden, they were accepted. The necessity of shared infrastructure shaped behavior. People dressed appropriately for frequent trips outside. Footwear was easy to remove and put on. Paths were kept clear. As a result, the street became an extension of the home. In dense neighborhoods, doors and screens opened directly onto narrow lanes. These lanes were not simply passages, they were living spaces. Laundry was washed and dried nearby. Tools were repaired outside. Small tasks were performed in view of neighbors. The boundary between inside and outside was soft and flexible. Children played close to home, always within sight. Adults moved between tasks without retreating fully indoors. This created a continuous flow of presence. Sounds traveled easily. Footsteps, water, voices. Privacy existed, but it was quiet and internal rather than spatial. People learned to ignore what was not meant for them. This was not indifference, it was familiarity.
Urban density amplified seasonal effects. Rain changed the sound and texture of streets. Water pooled in low places. People moved carefully. Humidity lingered between buildings. Air circulation mattered. Openings were adjusted throughout the day. In summer, shade from buildings created cooler paths. In winter, wind moved through streets, sharpening the cold. Street life adjusted naturally. Markets, small vendors, and deliveries passed through these shared spaces. Goods arrived on foot. Transactions were brief. Because many people lived and worked close together, movement was constant but gentle. There were no large empty spaces. Every corner held purpose. This closeness also meant increased awareness of risk. Fire, especially, was always present in the background. With buildings made primarily of wood and paper, and with cooking and lighting relying on open flame, neighborhoods lived with constant caution. Lamps were watched. Fires were managed carefully. When fires did occur, they spread quickly. Cities like Edo experienced them often. After major fires, changes sometimes followed. Streets might be widened, open spaces created. These changes altered daily movement slightly, but life adapted. People rebuilt. They returned to routine. Infrastructure was resilient because it was simple. Shared wells reopened. Communal toilets were restored. Streets resumed their role as living space. Urban life did not retreat inward after disaster. It returned outward. This shared environment encouraged a sense of mutual observation. Neighbors noticed absence. They noticed change. But this awareness remained quiet. There was little need for conversation. Evening deepened. As daylight faded, lamps appeared. Small points of warm light marked doorways and paths. Movement slowed. Voices softened further. The street remained active, but gently so. People returned from baths. Some paused briefly to speak. Others passed without stopping. The neighborhood breathed together. These shared spaces made urban life possible within tight limits. They reduced the need for individual resources. They encouraged cooperation without formal agreement. Ordinary people did not think of infrastructure as a system. They experienced it as routine. And through this routine, city life maintained its quiet balance. As night approached fully, attention shifted once more toward rest, cleansing, and the release of the day's accumulated effort, drawing ordinary people toward a place of warmth and steam that waited patiently at the edge of the neighborhood. As night settled more fully over the neighborhood, ordinary people followed one of the most familiar evening paths, not toward entertainment, not toward spectacle, but toward warmth, water, and quiet release. For many urban residents during the Edo period, the public bath, the sento, was an essential part of daily life. It was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. Most homes did not have private bathing facilities. Space was limited, fire risk was constant, heating large amounts of water indoors was impractical. The bathhouse solved this simply. People arrived carrying small bundles, a towel, clean clothing, nothing more. Footwear was removed at the entrance. Bodies moved inward, following a familiar sequence learned early in life. Inside, the air was warm. Steam softened sound and light. Wooden walls absorbed moisture. Before entering the bath itself, people washed carefully. Water was poured over the body. Dirt and sweat from the day were removed. This washing was practical, not ceremonial. Cleanliness mattered. Then came the bath. Hot water surrounded tired bodies. Muscles loosened. Breathing slowed. The heat was steady, not overwhelming, just enough to draw the day out of the body. Conversation, if it happened, was gentle. Neighbors exchanged brief remarks. News passed quietly. Often, silence was preferred. The bathhouse created a shared pause, a moment when work ended fully. Children learned to bathe alongside adults. They observed the rhythm. They learned patience. The bath was not separated by class among ordinary people. Everyone used the same space. Differences were minimal. This shared experience reinforced familiarity. Bodies were present, but attention remained respectful. After bathing, people dried themselves slowly. Clothing was adjusted. Hair was arranged simply. Stepping back into the night air felt cooling and grounding. Steam faded behind them. Outside, streets were dimmer now. Lanterns marked doorways. Movement was slower. The bathhouse marked a clear transition. Before it, the day remained active. After it, rest approached. For many, the path from bathhouse led directly home. Dinner followed, if it had not already been eaten, or tea was poured quietly. Warmth lingered in the body. In colder months, the bath was especially important. It helped people endure unheated homes and cold nights. In humid summers, it cleansed and refreshed. Seasonality shaped the experience. Winter baths felt longer, summer baths shorter. The bathhouse adapted naturally. Sento were also social anchors. They reinforced neighborhood awareness. Absence was noticed. But this was not intrusive. It was simply familiarity. No one lingered excessively. The bath was not entertainment. It was rhythm. Cleanliness in Edo period cities was not accidental. It emerged from necessity and habit.
Public baths made hygiene possible in dense environments. They reduced illness, they improved comfort, but most importantly, they created a daily moment of calm. As people returned home from the bath, night had fully arrived. Shutters were closed, rooms were lit dimly. Oil lamps cast small pools of light. Voices softened further. Families gathered briefly. Tasks were completed. Bedding was prepared. The body, now clean and warm, accepted rest more easily. Outside, the neighborhood quieted. Footsteps became rare. Only occasional movement passed through the streets. The bathhouse, now closing, released its final steam into the night air. And as ordinary people settled into sleep, the city held its breath. But even as night deepened, not everything was free to move or change. Beyond the quiet neighborhoods, systems of control and permission shaped how far and how freely ordinary people could travel, shaping movement itself as part of daily life. As ordinary people slept and neighborhoods rested in darkness, the wider world beyond the city remained carefully organized. Movement itself was part of daily life, but it was never entirely free. It followed rules, documents, and quiet checks that shaped how far a person could go. During the Edo period, travel within Japan was officially controlled. Roads connected cities, towns, and villages, but passage along them required awareness and preparation. This system was not chaotic, it was deliberate. Along major routes stood checkpoints, known as sekisho. These were not grand structures, often simple barriers, gates, or guarded points where travelers paused. At these checkpoints, documents were examined, permissions were checked, movement was acknowledged. For ordinary people, this meant that travel was not spontaneous. It required reason, planning, time. Traveling even a moderate distance could be an event. Documents mattered. Written permissions confirmed identity, purpose, and destination. Literacy, therefore, supported movement. This connected directly to everyday learning. Being able to read and present documents was not an abstract skill. It shaped how a person navigated the world. Despite these controls, movement did not stop. People still traveled. Pilgrimages provided one of the most common reasons. Religious journeys allowed ordinary people to leave their home areas legally. These trips followed established routes and rhythms. Merchants traveled to obtain goods. Artisans moved when work required it. Families relocated when circumstances changed. Travel existed within a framework. Roads themselves reflected this balance. They were busy but not crowded. Movement was steady, measured. Travelers walked, carried their belongings, stopped at rest points. Inns and roadside facilities supported this flow. Food was simple, rest brief. Journeys were not fast. They unfolded gradually, shaped by terrain and weather. Seasonality mattered here as well. Rain slowed travel, snow limited routes. Heat shortened walking hours. Travelers adjusted instinctively. At checkpoints, waiting was expected. Queues formed quietly. Documents were reviewed. This process was not aggressive. It was routine.
The presence of control influenced behavior even when checkpoints were not visible. People planned routes carefully. They respected boundaries. For most ordinary people, daily life did not involve travel. Work, food, family, and rest existed close to home. Movement beyond familiar areas was rare. This made travel memorable. It carried weight. The roads themselves became part of imagination and storytelling. They represented connection to a wider world, but also distance from routine. Urban residents might encounter travelers passing through. Footsteps, bundles, clothing marked by long use. These encounters were brief. The system of control did not feel oppressive to those living within it. It was normalized. Movement was regulated not to stop life, but to stabilize it. This balance contributed to the long peace of the period. People stayed rooted. Communities remained consistent. Even those who traveled returned eventually. Home remained the center. Documents, permissions, and checkpoints created a shared understanding of order. They shaped expectations. Ordinary people learned to move within this structure rather than challenge it. As a result, the world felt bounded but known. Distances were felt physically. Time mattered. This awareness reinforced the importance of local life. Neighborhoods, villages, daily routines. The wider world existed, but it did not intrude constantly. As night gave way to early morning once again, roads quieted. Checkpoints stood still. Paths waited. The rhythm of ordinary life returned inward. And within these limits of space, movement, and permission, people shaped their days carefully, finding stability not in freedom of motion, but in familiarity, routine, and repetition. Within these limits of space and movement, another presence quietly shaped everyday awareness. It did not announce itself often, but it was never forgotten. Fire lived close to ordinary people. In Edo period cities, almost everything was made of materials that burned easily. Wood formed walls, floors, and beams. Paper served as windows and partitions. Straw and cloth filled roofs, mats, and daily objects. Fire was necessary. It cooked food. It warmed bodies. It provided light after sunset. But it was also dangerous. Every household used flame in some form. Heaths burned daily. Oil lamps glowed softly through the night. Candles marked evening routines. This made caution a habit rather than a rule. People learned early how to manage fire. Lamps were placed carefully. Flames were never left unattended. Cooking was watched closely. Even small mistakes could matter. In dense neighborhoods, where houses stood wall to wall, a single spark could travel quickly. Wind moved easily through narrow streets. Paper screens offered little resistance. Cities like Edo experienced fires frequently. Some were small and contained, others spread across entire districts. Fire was not treated as an unexpected disaster. It was an understood risk. This understanding shaped behavior long before flames appeared. People kept possessions minimal. They stored what mattered most in portable form.
Bedding, documents, and essential items could be gathered quickly. This readiness was quiet and practical. When fires did break out, neighborhoods responded collectively. People moved with urgency but without panic. Shouts carried information. Water was brought where possible. Firefighting methods were simple: buckets, axes, clearing space. Authorities maintained systems to manage this risk. After major fires, changes sometimes followed. Streets were widened. Open gaps were created between blocks. These adjustments altered daily movement slightly. Paths changed. Distances shifted. Life adapted.
Fire watch and awareness became part of the city's rhythm. Nighttime vigilance mattered. Lanterns were monitored. Shutters were closed carefully. In some areas, fire lookout systems existed. Signals warned of danger. Responses followed established patterns. Despite this constant awareness, fear did not dominate daily life. People continued to cook, work, and rest as usual. The key was familiarity. Fire was treated with respect rather than anxiety. It was part of the environment, like weather. In winter, fire was essential. Homes were unheated otherwise. People gathered close to warmth. In summer, fire use was minimized. Cooking was adjusted. Movement slowed. Seasonality again shaped behavior. Urban density meant that rebuilding after fires was common. Entire neighborhoods could change. People relocated temporarily, then returned. This cycle of loss and reconstruction did not erase community. It reinforced it. Neighbors rebuilt together. Layouts shifted slightly, but routines returned. Fire shaped the appearance of cities. It influenced architecture. It encouraged simplicity. Buildings were not meant to last forever. They were meant to be replaced. This impermanence was accepted. It did not diminish attachment. It changed expectations. Ordinary people learned not to invest meaning in permanence of structure. Meaning lived in routine, relationships, and habit. Homes could be rebuilt. Life continued. Fire also influenced evening behavior. Night was quieter. Movement reduced. Oil lamps provided limited light. Large areas remained dark. This darkness reduced activity naturally. Sleep arrived earlier. Rest followed. Urban nights were not lively. They were careful. Through this balance of necessity and risk, cities survived. They grew. They adapted. Fire did not stop urban life. It shaped it. And as ordinary people navigated this ever-present element, they developed an attentiveness that extended into every aspect of daily living, from how they stored possessions to how they moved through space. This attentiveness carried into clothing, appearance, and the quiet rules that governed what could be worn and displayed, rules that shaped identity without being loudly enforced. As daily life continued within wooden walls and shared streets, appearance followed the same principles as everything else. Clothing was practical, restrained, and closely tied to routine. For ordinary people in Edo period Japan, what one wore was shaped less by personal expression and more by material reality. Most garments were made from cotton or hemp.
These fabrics were breathable, durable, and suited to daily labor. Cotton gradually became more common over time, especially in urban areas. It was comfortable against the skin and easier to wash. Hemp and ramie remained important, particularly in rural settings. Silk existed, but it did not belong to everyday life for most. Its use was often restricted by sumptuary rules that aimed to limit visible luxury among non-elite groups. These rules were not always enforced aggressively, but they set clear expectations. Ordinary people understood these boundaries. Clothing was therefore modest in appearance. Colors tended toward muted tones. Blues, browns, grays, and soft earth colors dominated daily wear. Patterns existed, but they were subtle. Small repeats, understated designs. Decoration did not disappear, it moved inward. People expressed taste through lining fabrics, careful stitching, and quiet contrasts hidden from immediate view. This creativity within limits allowed individuality without violating expectations. Garments were loose and layered. They allowed movement. They adapted to weather. In summer, layers were reduced. Fabrics were lighter. Sleeves moved freely to allow air to circulate. In winter, additional layers were added. Clothing became heavier. Belts and wraps secured warmth. Footwear followed the same logic. Straw sandals were common, easy to replace, practical for frequent walking. Footwear was removed often, at home, at schools, at bathhouses. This repeated removal shaped posture and movement. People moved carefully. They were attentive to thresholds.
Clothing required regular care. Washing was done by hand. Drying depended on weather. In humid seasons, keeping garments dry was a constant concern. Mold and odor were managed through attention and habit. Clothing was repaired rather than replaced. Small tears were stitched, worn areas reinforced. A garment carried the marks of use. This was not seen as neglect. It was normal. Children wore simplified versions of adult clothing. They learned early how to fold, store, and maintain garments. Clothing also reflected work. Artisans dressed for movement. Farmers dressed for weather and soil. Urban clothing and rural clothing differed slightly, but the underlying principles were the same. Cleanliness mattered. Even simple garments were kept as neat as possible. Public appearance reflected household order. Carelessness was noticed. Despite restrictions, fashion existed in quiet form. Trends moved slowly. Colors shifted subtly over time. People noticed these changes without naming them. Clothing also marked the rhythm of the day. Work clothes differed from evening clothes, even if only slightly. Bathing marked a transition. Clean garments followed. This change signaled rest. Clothing was not a display of wealth. It was a signal of belonging and competence. Within shared neighborhoods, appearance blended. People looked similar. Differences were understated. This created visual harmony. No one stood out sharply. Attention remained on behavior rather than display. These clothing practices supported social stability. They reduced visible inequality among ordinary people. They reinforced shared identity. And as garments were folded away at night, replaced by bedding and rest, the day's visible layer disappeared quietly. But clothing was only one surface of daily life. Beneath it lay deeper patterns of seasonal change, rural rhythm, and the way time itself moved across fields and villages,
shaping work and rest far from the city streets.
Beyond the city streets and shared wells, life opened into wider spaces. Fields replaced alleys, wind replaced walls, and routine followed the land more closely than any street or schedule. In rural areas during the Edo period, ordinary people lived in minka, folk houses shaped directly by work and weather. These homes were built from materials close at hand: wood for the frame, clay for walls, straw or thatch for roofing. They stood low and wide, grounded in the landscape. Their form reflected practicality rather than display. Inside, space was organized around daily function. At the center of many rural homes lay the irori, a sunken hearth set into the floor. It was not hidden, it was the heart of the house. The irori provided warmth during cold months. It offered light when daylight faded. It served as a place to cook and to gather. Family members sat around it. Work paused there. Conversation happened quietly. Smoke rose slowly from the hearth, drifting upward before escaping through gaps in the roof. Over time, this smoke darkened beams and dried the structure. It protected the house from insects and moisture. The smell of smoke became familiar. It clung to clothing and wood. It marked the home as lived in. Rural life followed the seasons closely. There was little separation between household and work. Fields lay nearby. Tools rested close to the door. Morning began early, before heat or weather could interfere. In planting season, attention focused on timing. Water levels mattered. Soil condition mattered. Rice cultivation required coordination. Fields were shared. Irrigation systems connected households. Work was communal by necessity. People depended on one another. During growing months, days were long, movement steady, bodies adapted. In harvest season, effort intensified. Grain was cut, gathered, and stored carefully. Storage mattered as much as growing. Winter changed everything. Fields rested. Work moved indoors. Repair, preparation, and maintenance filled the days. The irori became central. Hands worked near warmth. Tools were fixed. Clothing was mended. Food preparation followed seasonal patterns. Preserved vegetables, grains, and stored items sustained households. Fresh options were limited. Meals remained simple: rice, soup, pickles. Rural diets mirrored urban ones in simplicity, but differed in sourcing. What was grown nearby shaped what was eaten. Winter nights were long. Darkness arrived early. Light came from fire. Oil lamps were used sparingly. The hearth provided most illumination. Families gathered closer. Stories were shared quietly. Silence was common. In summer, the house opened outward. Doors and screens allowed air to move. Shade mattered. Humidity shaped posture and pace. Work paused during the hottest hours. Rest was seen as laziness, but necessity. Rain shaped sound and movement. Fields softened. Muddy paths grew muddy. Clothing adjusted. Layers changed. Drying garments required attention. Rural homes lacked the density of cities, but they were not isolated. Neighbors lived within walking distance. Shared work brought people together. Social life unfolded naturally through labor. There was little separation between cooperation and community. Children learned through participation. They watched adults. They assisted where possible. Education was informal. Knowledge passed through action rather than instruction. The rhythm of rural life was slower, but not easier. It demanded constant awareness of environment. Mistakes had visible consequences. Missed timing affected harvest. Weather could undo weeks of work. This uncertainty encouraged humility. Plans remained flexible. Yet there was stability in repetition. Seasons returned, patterns repeated. Life did not aim to progress quickly. It aimed to continue. Homes aged alongside families. Beams darkened, floors wore smooth. The house held memory in its structure. The irori marked time through layers of ash and smoke. Rural nights were quieter than urban ones. Sound traveled farther. Insects filled the air. Wind moved through fields. Stars appeared clearly. Sleep came naturally after physical work. Bodies rested deeply. From these villages, food and materials moved toward cities. Connections remained constant. Rural life supported urban life. Urban markets supported rural needs. Together, they formed a single system shaped by season, land, and habit. And as the year moved forward, weather shifted again. Rain gave way to clarity. Heat softened into cool air. Seasonal change became the quiet music beneath everyday life, a pattern that returned again and again, guiding ordinary people through time without needing to be named. This slow return of seasons formed a kind of quiet music beneath everyday life. It did not demand attention. It simply continued, guiding movement, work, and rest. For ordinary people in Edo period Japan, the year was not divided by dates. It was divided by feeling, by air, by light, by moisture and cold. Spring arrived gently. The air softened. The ground released its winter stiffness. Fields prepared themselves. Hands returned to familiar tasks. Movement felt lighter. Rain increased, not suddenly, but steadily. Soil darkened. Paths grew softer. Spring rain was expected. It brought growth. It also brought mud. People adjusted their pace. Footwear changed. Clothing dried more carefully. Summer followed with humidity. Air grew heavy. Movement slowed naturally. Monsoon rains shaped daily behavior. Work began earlier. Midday rest became necessary. Homes opened themselves to air. Screens shifted. Shadows mattered. Clothing grew lighter. Skin met fabric differently. Sweat was accepted as part of the season. Food adjusted as well. Meals remained simple, but timing shifted. Hot food was eaten carefully. Water was valued.
Evenings brought some relief. Insects filled the air with sound. Night arrived slowly.
Autumn cooled everything. Air sharpened. Movement became easier again. Fields changed color. Harvest approached. Work intensified briefly. Timing mattered. Autumn was practical. Preparation replaced growth. Stored food increased. Clothing layers returned. Wind carried different sounds, dry leaves, clear footsteps. Winter arrived unevenly across the country. In regions facing the Sea of Japan, snow became a constant presence. Roofs carried weight. Paths disappeared. Daily routines shifted inward. Movement slowed. Work adapted. On the Pacific side, winters were often dry but cold. Wind cut through clothing. Warmth became central. Homes relied on hearths. Bodies gathered closer. Light was limited. Days shortened. Night arrived early. Sleep followed sooner. Throughout all seasons, people did not fight the weather. They adjusted to it. There was no expectation of control, only response. Seasonal change shaped sound. Rain muffled streets. Snow softened everything. Heat changed voice. Cold changed posture. Smell changed too. Wet earth, dry wood, smoke. Even texture shifted. Tatami responded to humidity. Clothing felt different on the skin. This awareness was constant. It did not require thought. Ordinary people learned to read the environment as naturally as reading a familiar face. Seasonality also shaped social rhythm. Festivals aligned with seasons. Work cycles followed weather. But even without celebration, change was felt daily. The year moved forward quietly. Not in leaps, but in slow transitions. One season never ended abruptly, it softened into the next. This gradual movement supported stability. Nothing shocked the system. Even hardship was anticipated. Cold would come, heat would pass. People prepared, not with anxiety, but with habit. Seasonal rhythm also created memory. Years were remembered by harvests, by weather patterns, by difficulty or ease. Time was personal and environmental. As seasons repeated again and again, they carried people gently forward through years without asking them to notice the passage of time. From this quiet music of weather and work, the final picture of ordinary life begins to emerge, not as a story of events, but as a steady continuity that held families, neighborhoods, and generations together.
From this quiet movement of seasons, the full shape of ordinary life becomes visible, not as a series of events and not as a story of progress, but as something steadier and more enduring. Life for ordinary people in Edo period Japan did not rely on constant change, it relied on continuation. Days followed one another without needing to be distinguished. Morning returned, work resumed, evening softened into night. This repetition was not emptiness, it was structure. Within narrow homes and shared streets, within fields and workshops, people built lives that held together because they were predictable, not rigid, but familiar. Stability came from knowing what the next day would likely bring: water to draw, rice to prepare, work to do, space to clean, rest to return to. There was comfort in this. Ordinary people did not measure their lives by milestones or achievements. They measured them by continuity, by seasons completed, by routines maintained. Families grew within these patterns. Children learned by watching. Adults adjusted without needing instruction. Knowledge passed quietly, not through declarations, but through action. The world around them reinforced this rhythm. Climate shaped behavior, housing shaped movement, materials shaped caution. Nothing invited excess, nothing encouraged urgency. Even control and limitation of space, of movement, of display created a sense of order rather than confinement. Life felt bounded but known. Communities held together through proximity and habit. Neighbors noticed one another without needing explanation. Shared wells, baths, streets, and sounds created connection without conversation. Silence was common, and silence was comfortable. Ordinary life did not aim to stand out, it aimed to continue smoothly.
This is why disruption felt rare. Change arrived slowly. Even disaster, like fire or poor harvest, was absorbed into routine. Rebuilding followed known patterns. Loss was accepted as part of impermanence. Nothing was expected to last forever. Homes could burn, clothing could wear out, tools could break. What mattered was the ability to return to routine. This acceptance shaped emotional life as well. Attachment existed, but it was tempered by understanding. People did not cling tightly to objects or appearances. Meaning lived in repetition, in daily presence. Even leisure followed this principle. Storytelling, festivals, small pleasures. They did not interrupt life, they folded into it. Time moved forward quietly. Years passed without being counted. Old age arrived not as a sharp transition, but as a gradual slowing. Elders remained part of routine. They watched. They remembered. The environment reflected this calm endurance. Weather changed, buildings aged, fields renewed. Nothing demanded attention. Everything invited patience. From the outside, such a life may appear limited, but from within, it was coherent. Ordinary people lived inside a world that asked little and provided enough. Enough structure, enough familiarity, enough stability. There was no need to search constantly for meaning. Meaning was embedded in doing. And so, as night returned once more, lanterns dimmed, voices softened, and streets emptied, life did not conclude. It paused. Sleep arrived naturally, not as escape, but as continuation. Tomorrow would resemble today, and that resemblance was not failure. It was success. This is how ordinary people actually lived in old Japan, not dramatically, not heroically, but steadily. And as you rest now, letting the rhythm of this quiet world settle, you can allow the repetition to continue on its own, carrying life forward, one calm day at a time.